the governor and his staff of commissioners and secretaries. But you go back even further, my first go-around with what was the Louisiana Office of Emergency Preparedness before there was a GOSEP, that goes all the way back to 1992, Hurricane Andrew. That was my first connection with the State Emergency Management Office, and it was during Andrew that I had my first connection with state governors, one-on-one interview with Edwin Edwards, preparing him for ABC's Nightline, if you might remember that show. In fact, I had met with him at, ironically, WBRZ to brief him to get him ready for his interview with ABC. So my experience with state emergency management goes back more than 4 decades. I arrived at LSU in '85. LSU brought me here because of my work as a biological climatologist. My training is actually biology. So for those of you, again, who don't know this, TV was literally an accident. It was nothing I ever pursued. Channel 9 asked me to come do some weekends. Some weekends became every weekend, and then 7 years later, every weekend became every day. When Mike Graham retired, the TV station made me an offer that my wife wouldn't refuse. At the time, though, I started out part-time at Channel 9, and then when I went full-time at Channel 9, I maintained a half-time appointment at LSU. So there were 12 years where I was doing both jobs. Well, who'd have thunk I'd be doing both jobs again, except this time one different location. So I worked with the Louisiana Office of Emergency Preparedness during the 90s. In the 2000s, the Homeland Security angle became a part of emergency preparedness. I worked one-on-one briefing Governor Foster during George's in the late 90s. And then Governor Jindal brought me into the UCG during his administration. And then Governor John Bell Edwards continued that track record. And I worked through his administrations as well. Now, there was a bit of an advantage here for me. That advantage was the government street traffic and the WAFB management that was willing to allow me to do the work for the UCG and for GOSEP while I was full-time at Channel 9. So in 2008, I officially retired from LSU, went full-time only at WAFB. So let's fast forward to last year, 2024. Jacques Thibodeau reaches out to me and says, would I be interested in coming to work for GOSEP? Well, I was getting close to 30 years at WAFB. I thought, hey, this might be a little bit of a rejuvenation. Plus, it was going to allow me to get back to what I'd really trained for, which was climate science as opposed to day-to-day forecasting. So I thought about it, and then at the same time, purely coincidentally, a confluence, if you will, of coincidences, the provost, Roy Haggerty at LSU, calls me up. Now, he doesn't want me to come to work. He wants me to participate in an effort to redefine the state climatologist role at LSU and the state climatology program on campus. At the time, he was unaware of the fact that the governor was intending to bring the state climatologist into GOSEP. So I met with Dr. Haggerty and Dr. Matt Lee, who's just served as the interim president recently. Dr. Lee, now the vice president of agriculture and the Ag Center at LSU. And we outlined the role of the state climatologist. And the reason we were doing this was because in the agricultural community, people were a little perturbed. In fact, they were downright upset with the U.S. drought monitor. Some of you may be aware of this weekly drought monitor that presents the drought conditions in the state on a week-by-week basis. Actually, it's a national product, but no one was really keeping their thumb on the situation here in Louisiana. The previous state climatologist, Dr. Barry Kime, excuse me, he did some of that work, but it was never a mandate for him. And Dr. Kime was much more research-oriented. I'm a very operationally oriented kind of person. So under Dr. Haggerty's committee there, we outlined what we thought the state climatologist should be. Now, at the time, I didn't happen to mention to him that he probably wasn't going to have the state climatologist on campus anymore. So I left the meeting, hadn't been at LSU now at this point for 15 plus years. 2 days later, I get a surprise call, and the provost is asking me, did I want the position? Well, I said, Provost, I'm really flattered, and it's an intriguing offer, but I know the LSU salary structure, and you can't even get anywhere in the ballpark of my TV job. So he asked me what I was making, and I actually lowballed it, and he still chuckled. So I knew that wasn't going to happen, and that was fine. Meanwhile, things are pushing forward with my potential of moving to GOSEP. Well, about a week later, the provost calls me again, and by now he's aware of what's going on at GOSEP in the state climatologist position. And he says, okay, I hear what you're doing there. Would you be willing to come back to LSU on a part-time basis to manage the state office? Because even though the state climatologist was moving to GOSEP, the state office was not. It was going to stay on campus. So after some negotiating and a commitment by the provost to really man up the state climate office, including giving me 2 professionals, 1 PhD and 1 master's who had 15 years of experience in climate science, operational climate science, I said, well, sure, I'll come back because those 2 will do all the work and I'll get all the credit. So, so effectively now I'm back to working 2 jobs again, 100% at GOSEP, 25% at LSU. But my objective here is to make those 2 jobs essentially seamless so that you really can't tell who I'm working for from one day to the next. And we've changed some things here. We now have a drought monitoring team. So it's not just us monitoring the drought at the state office, but we've incorporated all 4 National Weather Service offices that serve Louisiana, and we brought in representatives from the Department of Ag and Forestry. So we now have a core of people that weekly provide input that we send up the ladder to the national authors to monitor and track the drought monitor for Louisiana. That's working out exceptionally well. The other thing that we've changed from the prior state climate program, which was research driven, is we've become very operationally driven with day-to-day monitoring, and we produce both a weekly and a monthly climate summary for Louisiana. If you're interested in getting that summary, it's free. Just reach out to me after the meeting today, and I'll be glad to add you to that mailing list. It comes as a PDF in your email box. It shows up Thursday or Friday, typically, and it allows you to see how we arrived at, for example, the week-by-week drought monitor assessment. And most importantly, what I've done with the connections that I have, both from my climatology round one, my TV work, and now my GOSEP work, is to develop a closer connection with the agencies within the state and particularly within agriculture in Louisiana, providing a core service benefit to the agricultural community that really hasn't been there since I was the state climatologist back from 91 to 2003. Back then, I had a part-time appointment in the Ag Center, and even though my appointment at LSU now is a quarter-time appointment, part-time again, it's actually split in half one more time, half with the Ag Center and half with the College of the Coast and Environment. So for me, this is the best of all worlds, and I can't thank WAFB enough for what they did to allow me to not only serve the community here locally, but also to establish a presence in state government that actually led to a lot of these opportunities for me. So that gives you a little bit of background of how I've gotten to where I am now. Let's change gears a little bit and talk about the past hurricane season. So I'm going to ask you first, busy or quiet season?
Busy overall, quiet here.
Quiet relatively, and the relative part is for Louisiana. And believe you me, that's the part that I only worry about. For two reasons. One is these last 25 years have been the busiest 25 years on record for Louisiana in terms of the tropics. And these last 5 or 6 years have just been abysmal. So we needed a break. Not only that, I don't need the overtime. So I was glad to have a quiet year, and I'll be glad to have 2 or 3 more quiet years while I wait to retire for a third time from GOSEP. But don't be fooled. Even though the U.S. didn't have a landfalling hurricane, first time in a decade that the entire U.S. coastline avoided a landfall, there was a landfall, Chantal, in the Carolinas, and there were 6 fatalities linked to that. And there was a landfall in the Gulf of Mexico, Barry, a tropical storm, but it wasn't in the United States. Except, and this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, this past season was a good example of how you still don't have to have a landfall in your backyard to be impacted. Do you remember the horrific flooding in Texas on the July 4th weekend? Over 130 fatalities. That rainstorm was the remnants of Barry that moved all the way out of Mexico into Texas. So here's an example of a storm that literally overland moved about 400 miles and was the cause of catastrophic flooding in the state of Texas. The other thing to keep in mind, even though we were fortunate to have most of those storms stay out in the Atlantic, there were some red lights, some real alarms that went off. 5 hurricanes this season, 4 of them became major hurricanes, 4 of the 5. That's above normal. And of those 4 that were majors, 3 of them were Cat 5s, the second greatest number of Cat 5s in any season. So even though the numbers for the season were a little bit lower than what sort of the consensus forecasts were calling for, it was still a high-end season in terms of energy and potential destruction. And of course, Melissa, the second most powerful storm ever in the Atlantic, and tied for the most powerful landfalling storm in the Atlantic, reminds us that Even though the U.S. was spared, not everybody was so lucky. So what about that quiet pattern in the Gulf? Absolutely happy about it, but again, that's not exceptionally rare. If we go back over the last 15 to 20 years, there are 3 other seasons where there was only one tropical storm in the Gulf. So this wasn't necessarily as rare as some people might think, but indeed, it was a quiet year, and I'll say it again, I'm ready for a handful more of quiet years for the Bayou State. Are we going to be that lucky? No way. All right, third topic, and then we'll take some questions. How many of you are kind of keeping up with the winter weather? Not so much here, although we've had 2 cold snaps, but are you aware of what's going on in the northern states? A couple of you are, and in fact, they're about ready to get hit with a triple whammy over the next week. 3 snowstorms are going to roll through the northern states in the coming days. Now, what's the buzzword that the media, buzz 2 words actually, that the media loves to drop explaining this unusual outbreak of bitterly cold Arctic air?
River. Something river.
Polar vortex. Polar vortex. Okay, now, here's the thing. The polar vortex is always there. It's always there. It's there and very strong most winters. What really we should be calling this is the polar vortex disruption, because the polar vortex circulates the North Pole, but when it gets disrupted, when it changes that circulation around the North Pole, it creates openings, because when that polar vortex is tightly circulating the North Pole, it tends to keep the coldest air concentrated up around and inside the Arctic Circle. But when the polar vortex is disrupted, it becomes more wavy. We see big dips and troughs in the jet stream, and that allows that cold air to spill southward. Now, here we are looking at these frigid outbreaks in the eastern states, along with big snows. But what's going on in the west? It's much warmer than normal, because there's a ridge in the western states and a trough in the eastern states. That trough in the eastern states is what's allowing that cold air to dive southward. But the ridge in the western states allows warm air to move northward. So with these polar vortex disruptions, we tend to see a bigger ridge trough pattern. The question, though, is where do the troughs set up and the ridges set up? What goes up must come down, but the ridges and the troughs don't always set up in the pattern that they're set up right now. There are times where a trough develops in the west and a ridge forms in the east. That didn't happen during this recent polar vortex disruption, polar vortex outbreak, but it can in other fashions of this outbreak. So, question then becomes, now this is the earliest polar vortex disruption we've seen since 2000. And in fact, if we go back 50, 60, 70 years, some climate scientists will tell you there have only been 3 or 4 of these events going all the way back to the 1950s. And by that, I mean 3 or 4 that occurred in November. And that's when this one began. Now, fortunately for us, we're going to start a slow sort of milder trend as we get into the middle of the month. And you may be cursing the climate scientists by Christmas week as we get back to what I prefer, 60s and 70s. But this cold spell we're dealing with right here, this is us on the fringe of that very bitter Arctic air that's impacting the northeastern quarter of the country and extending all the way up into Canada, all because of the disruption of the polar vortex. So the question I get a lot very recently is, if this is so early in the season, could we see another event like this later in the winter? And the answer is the chance is not zero, but it is very, very unlikely. So the outlook for the rest of the winter, beginning at the end of December, is for a relatively mild December for Louisiana. I mean, January and February, relatively mild January and February for Louisiana, and probably also a period there that'll be a little bit on the dry side. So then the question becomes, well, does that mean the drought will continue? We've had a decent amount of rain these last 7 to 10 days, so we've taken a bite out of the drought, but we probably won't bring the drought completely to an end for a few weeks down the road, maybe even a couple of months down the road. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because dryness, as long as it's not exceptionally dry, dryness in the winter and early spring can be a little benefit to Louisiana, because winter and spring are really our flood season. A lot of people think it's the tropical season, but flooding, half of our flooding occurs in the winter and early spring. A drier than normal winter at least brings that flood threat down a little bit. Doesn't eliminate it, but it does reduce it a little bit. So to close then, even though we've been on the cool side and on the wet side the last week or 10 days or so, you can probably expect a relatively mild rest of the winter. That doesn't mean there won't be some cold snaps, but averaged over the 60 to 90 days, temperatures will be near normal or maybe even a little bit above normal for the period. And again, probably leaning on the drier side, largely because we're still in a weak La Nina. And for the southern parishes, La Nina, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 La Nina winters end up being drier than normal. So that takes me right to about 20 of. Happy to open it up for questions, in which I'll be more than happy to say I don't know to anything you ask.
So these increasing number of polar disruptions, why are they increasing?
So the question is, why are we having this polar disruption? Okay, so the answer to that is a college lecture. There are actually 4 pieces of input that create this disruption. And in this case, each of those individually could create a disruption, but the fact that all 4 of them are in place is why I believe this is such an intense disruption of the polar vortex, and also why it's so rare to have events of this intensity. What's kind of odd is that 2 of those pieces of input, in fact, actually 3 of them, are in the tropics. Well, 2 of them deal with the circulation shift in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere in the tropics that translates into the northern hemisphere and helps disrupt the normal flow of the atmosphere there. One of them is called the quasi-biennial oscillation. I won't even try to explain that to you. The other is La Nina. In this setup of weak La Ninas, that can also add to the disruption. There is also the strong Siberian high pressure over Siberia that helps create the ridging in the west and the troughing in the east. So that accentuates the dive southward of that bitterly cold air. And then there's another phase called the Madden-Julian oscillation, the MJO, and it also is a tropical circulation that can enhance the potential for these polar vortex disruptions. So the intensity of this one is enhanced by the fact that all four of those features are in play right now. Not a very satisfactory answer, I can see by the look on your face. But the thing is, all of these events are so complex. There's no way to say, oh, it's because it's 75 degrees in Tucson. I wish it was that easy. It just isn't. And for something this unique and rare to occur so early in the season, you know that there's more than one or two things coming into play to create a big dynamic shift in the circulation over the North Pole. Now, ultimately the question becomes, is this related to climate change? And the short answer to that is possibly. The difference here is whether we're talking climate change, which is a long-term shift, or climate variability, which occurs on an interannual basis. This is clearly a measure of climate variability. It's hard to really define it as climate change. Confusing enough? I don't know, would have been a better answer, wouldn't it? In the back.
The oceans are getting warmer. The oceans are getting warmer. The Arctic and melting. Are the models keeping up with the changes that are occurring? Or are the models behind, basically because they're looking so much at the last 50 years instead of what's happening more recent?
Well, it's true the oceans are getting warmer, and it's true the atmosphere is getting warmer. There's no question that there's been changes there, and I'll get it said, there's no question that there's a human influence. I am not convinced yet that human activity is the primary influence, but it is certainly a contributing factor. So the oceans are getting warmer, and one of the things you have to think about is that the ocean and the atmosphere, how many of you have been to Spencer's, that crazy gift shop? And you ever see that teeter-totter thing that has blue on the bottom and clear on the top? What separates those layers? Density. The blue is heavier than the clear. Well, guess what? The atmosphere is a fluid from a physics standpoint, so we have the same thing going on. Just denser fluid, the ocean, sitting below a lighter fluid, the atmosphere. Change one, and it's going to change the other. The same way that teeter-totter shifts, even though it teeter-tots, you see the energy being transformed back and forth from one layer to the next. Well, the same thing is going on with the atmosphere and the ocean. In fact, that's precisely what ENSO, El Nino, and El Nino's evil sister, La Nina, are showing us, how the interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean can change the climate thousands of miles away. So the question about whether the models are keeping up with it, some people will tell you the models are actually out in front of it, and that they're projecting warmth that we haven't seen yet. So clearly some of the models for the atmosphere are running too warm for the current situation. So what that tells us is there's still a lot of work to be done. I do think, and I'm going to change gears on you a little bit here, I think we're going to see dramatic improvements, though, in the coming years, and by years I mean months more than years, because of AI. AI modeling, especially the Google DeepMind model, did better than all of the physics-based models for the hurricane season this past year. And in fact, the NHC freely admits that their forecasting skill was enhanced because of that AI model. Well, the question then is, okay, when is AI going to get into global year-round modeling? Well, they work on it already, and I think we're going to see improvements in both atmospheric and oceanographic forecasting with AI. Why is it better? Because AI learns from its mistakes, and it corrects itself through the process. So that in forecasting storms this past season, when it got off track, it got right back on track. And that's because of the speed in which the analysis is done compared to the standard physics-based models that we use.
Is LSU doing this work with AI?
Yes, it is. In fact, Dr. Georges Rouge is in the middle of doing some critical work for Louisiana, where he's looking at what we call compound flooding. So think about it. During a tropical event, what's the biggest flood threat? Depends on where you are. Good point. Along the coast, what's the biggest flood threat? Storm surge. For Baton Rouge, what's the biggest flood threat? Rain. Well, somewhere in between, those two link up, right? That's compound flooding. Surge plus rain. No model does that right now. There are some models in the works. In fact, GOSEP has joined with the Louisiana Water Institute working on a model for that that's been in the works for a couple of years now. Well, Dr. Rouge, in a little less, I think, than a year, has used AI to do the very same thing. The advantage of his model, it does in minutes what the physics-based model takes hours to do. And it corrects itself just like other AI models. It literally learns from itself, which in some ways frightens me a little bit, because AI kind of, to me, has this dangerous Terminator aspect to it. When are the computers going to realize humans are the problem? Yes, sir.
I gotta tell you, I didn't want to come here today, but your presentation was just so mesmerizing. And I think the citizens of Louisiana are glad you are not retired. But let me follow that up. The flagship institution, LSU, based on what you're telling me, and have told this audience here today, you're involved in, the Ag Center, you're involved with the coastal environment. I just wonder if there's any way that what you do can help explain why we got this story about the mosquito law. On one side of the road, we got males and females, and on the other side, we got nothing but one sex. And if that's climate-based, if that's something else, is that the kind of study that you'd be tasked to get with the appropriate branch at the flagship institution to try to figure out? Or is that something that, people might want to take to Tulane, the environmental law plant, for instance, or Southern, or one of the other university systems?
Well, not every institution can do everything, even the flagship. And the first thing you need is expertise. So I can assist and have assisted in work like mosquito threats, mosquito issues in the past. But that's not my area of expertise. I can help the expert with obtaining the data he needs, the weather and climate data, for him to do his work, his role. So, you know, I am proud of the work I did at LSU, and I'm proud of the work I'm doing at LSU. And I love to see that campus expand its influence and expand its focus on serving Louisiana and the Gulf Coast region. But there are other campuses in Louisiana that are doing extraordinary things. That includes Southern University. UL Monroe is putting in a 50-station network of weather stations around the state. In my first go-around as state climatologist, I tried to support an LSU-funded program just like that. We weren't successful because we just didn't have the resources. ULM has managed to pull it off. And then you go over to Lafayette, ULL, and UL Louisiana also has a key core of coastal scientists. So one of the things that I'm doing and LSU is doing, we've linked up with ULM to expand their operation and integrate it with ours so that we're getting the best of both worlds. And I do think we can see more of that, and that's part of what I'm trying to do between GOSEP and LSU, to make that linkage so that we don't have two different agencies doing the same thing, but pool those resources because the sum is greater than the parts.
Mr. Woodward? I know you said that there were some red alarms in this quiet hurricane season. Of the 5 named hurricanes, 4 were major, 3 were Category 5s. Are those storms just kind of stayed out in the Atlantic? And was that unusual? They just kind of stayed out there?
Okay, so well, it's unusual in the sense, excuse me. It's certainly unusual if we look back at the last 10 years, pointing out to the fact that it's been 10 years since the U.S. coast avoided a hurricane. So that's unusual right there. So what happened? Why did most of the storms stay out in the open Atlantic? It's a combination of 2 factors, and they're actually related. There's kind of a chicken and egg thing going on here. Remember we talked about ridges and troughs. So that trough that's over the East Coast now was unusually persistent over the eastern United States during the hurricane season. Normally, during the tropical season, the ridges and troughs retreat northward. The jet stream pulls northward. This past season, the jet stream tended to be a little bit further south. And by that, what we mean is the amplitude was much bigger than normal. So we had a trough over the eastern part of the country. And coupled with that, most of you have heard of the Bermuda High, which is high pressure over the Atlantic that extends really from the Azores, from the eastern Atlantic westward. When it expands over Bermuda, that's when storms, and keep in mind this is a high pressure ridge. So the circulation around this broad area of high pressure over the Atlantic is clockwise. So with this clockwise spin here, storms that start off the coast of Africa get caught in that flow and pushed farther west. They can't go through, or it's difficult for them to go through that ridge of high pressure. Think of that high pressure ridge as a blocking factor that pushes storms farther west gives them a better chance to get in the Caribbean. And if they get in the Caribbean, there's a pretty good chance they're going to come into the Gulf. This past season, that ridge of high pressure was compact and shifted east. So the storms could turn sooner because they didn't have that extension of high pressure farther to the west.
Thank you.
And it's really that simple. So you had the high pressure shifting east and the trough is flow that pushes things off to the east over the eastern United States. So most of those storms wrapped around that ridge of high pressure and got caught up in the trough flow, and that pushed them and kept them out in the open Atlantic.
Thank you.
I wanted to know if you've increased your work with the Ag Center. I know I do a lot of work in the rural communities, and the farmers are so important. Is there any new initiative?
Absolutely. Well, the initiative number one was the drought monitor. And by the way, why was the drought monitor? In fact, with the provost, the number one job now for the state climate office is monitoring and keeping up to date on the drought monitor. Why is that important? Because much of the USDA funding for drought-stricken communities is based on that one tool. And what happened in 2023 and 2024, where the drought monitor wasn't being kept up as it needed to be for Louisiana, and agriculturalists, both row crops and livestock, missed out on opportunities to get assistance from the USDA, not because the drought monitor didn't show drought, but it didn't show enough weeks of drought. And it should have. So that's where the tumble down effect started that ultimately brought me back to LSU. Am I more focused on agriculture? Not more focused than I was 20 years ago, but there was a 20-year gap where agriculture was less of a focus for the state climate office. Agriculture now is our number one focus, ag and forestry. I think that's a 1 o'clock bell. Thank you all very much.
Good seeing you again.
Good seeing you. How you been?
Good, doing great. Good. Here's my card.
Yep, I knew you, John.
Mark again. Thank you ever so much for returning all my calls.
Oh,
Thank you how much that means.
my pleasure.
Glad to see you doing well.
Jay, hey, Brooke Thorington.
Hi.
Nice to finally meet you in person.
Pleasure.
The one question I had is why are we starting to see the northern lights now?
All right, now that's a different thing. That's space weather. And so what happens with the northern